Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Freshman English, and we turn now in our MyPerspectives Volume 2, Unit 4, Star-Crossed Lovers. We are engaged in some literary criticism analyses. I'm with you on page 504, 505. After Rosenberg wrote Romeo and Juliet, it's a terrible play, and David Laveau's Can't Change That, we will have Noah Berlatsky who is going to respond. Let's go to page 505, introduce ourselves to Berlatsky. Born in 1971, he has been working as a freelance writer and editor for more than 20 years. He serves as editor for a comics and culture website. His works appeared in the Atlantic, Salon, The Old, Slate, as well as the Chicago Reader, as well as other popular blogs and websites. He's also been featured on National Public Radio's news program, All Things Considered. Now, let's get some background information here before we go to fight, right? Go to fight. It's intellectual fighting, and that's what makes it so much fun, right? After Alyssa Rosenberg's critique of the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet received a strong reader reaction, Noah Berlatsky will respond by describing his experience as an adult rereading the play about young lovers. So let's go ahead now. We're on page 508. Let's enjoy the counter-response argument. And then, of course, when we're finished, at 3b, in our personal response to these two texts, we'll be able to have some sense of which side we agree with, or maybe some of both. Let's enjoy.
In defense of Romeo and Juliet, it's not childish, it's about childishness, by Noah Berlatsky. I haven't read Romeo and Juliet since I was in high school 25 years ago. High school is, of course, a time of rampaging hormones and extravagant romantic angst. In theory, the perfect life moment to read Romeo and Juliet. In practice, I think my favorite character was Mercutio. I thought he was funny. I just reread the play last week, inspired by Alyssa Rosenberg's declaration at Slate that Romeo and Juliet is a terrible play. The comments section erupted in howls of outrage, but I was intrigued. Suddenly, I was curious to find out what I thought of a work I hadn't revisited in more than 2 decades. Rosenberg argued that Romeo and Juliet, a play about children, is full of terrible, deeply childish ideas about love. Juliet, Rosenberg reminds us, is 13. If you cast someone that age in the role now, the result is queasy. If you cast someone older, you end up with an adult actor behaving like she's a tween. Romeo's age is uncertain, but a lot of what he does is immature and adolescent as well. The lover's haste to marry strains credulity. It seems, though Rosenberg doesn't quite say this, like a childish fantasy of love at first sight. Similarly, the reconciliation of the lovers' warring families upon their demise reads for Rosenberg as an adolescent fantasy of death solving all problems. Adolescent or not, though, I sure enjoyed reading it this time through. Romeo and Juliet's first meeting, for example, all by itself validates the romantic comedy genre. Romeo to Juliet. If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle fine is this. My lips, 2 blushing pilgrims, ready stand, to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss. Juliet, good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much. Which mannerly devotion shows in this? For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss. Romeo, have not saints' lips and holy palmers too? Juliet, I pilgrim lips that they must use in prayer? That is some searingly saucy banter there. I pilgrim lips that they must use in prayer has to be one of the archest lines in all of literature. I'm with Romeo. I'd fall in love with that. In short, now that I'm an adult, I appreciate the young lovers a good bit more than I did when I was their age. This may be counterintuitive, but it also seems to be one of the main points of the play itself. a number of Rosenberg's commenters noted that Romeo and Juliet is deliberately about young love. This is no doubt true, but the play is also, and insistently, about age. The fact that Juliet is 13, for example, is not just mentioned once, it comes up again and again. Moreover, the first time Juliet appears on stage, her aged comic nurse launches into a rambling anecdote about when her charge was a toddler, an anecdote that Juliet clearly finds both tedious and embarrassing. Juliet's youth, then, is adamantly established and also adamantly presented as a source of fascination for the elderly. Old young remains an obsession throughout the play, but that obsession does not, interestingly, work in any single way. Sometimes being young means being rash and changeable, as when Romeo switches his hyperbolic affections from Rosalind to Juliet. Sometimes it means being a hope for the future, as when the friar marries the couple to try to end the feud between Montagues and Capulets. There are passages where old and young are presented as almost different species, as when Juliet irritably declaims, "Old folks, many fain as they were dead, unwieldy, slow, heavy, and pale as lead." And then there are moments where it seems like old and young don't really act all that differently. Juliet's hasty marriage to Romeo, for example, isn't much more precipitous than Lord Capulet's sudden decision to marry her to Paris. And Romeo's affections aren't any more changeable than those of the nurse, who, having cheerfully helped Juliet marry Romeo, just as cheerfully advises her to forget that first marriage and turn polyandrist by wedding as her father wishes. Rosenberg might argue that even the adults behave like kids in Romeo and Juliet because the play itself is childish. But is Capulet really childish? Is the nurse? Surely you don't have to be young to be precipitate or fickle. Adults behave like children with some frequency, and vice versa. For Romeo and Juliet, in other words, youth and age seem less like solid, immutable categories than like tropes. They're devices manipulated by Juliet or Romeo to give force to their sense of indignation or specialness, or manipulated by the nurse to give force to her affection and nostalgia, or manipulated by Shakespeare to sweep adults into a romantic swoon, or manipulated by Rosenberg to denigrate that same swooning. From this perspective, the point of the play isn't so much the exhilaration of young love or the dunderheadedness of young love. Rather, as often with Shakespeare, the point is the language itself, the dazzling, disturbing rhetorical force of old, young, corrupt, innocent, experienced, naive. Rosenberg claims that Romeo and Juliet is dated because of the uncomfortable way its childishness and its child protagonists sit in our contemporary culture. I'd argue, though, that uncomfortableness is not a contemporary addition, but is instead one of the things Shakespeare was writing about to begin with. At that first flirtatious meeting, for example, Romeo is masked with friends at a Capulet party. Old Capulet, seeing the maskers, reminisces about when he used to do the same. Capulet, what man? 'Tis not so much, 'tis not so much. 'Tis since the nuptials of Lucentio, come Pentecost as quickly as it will. Some 25 years, and then we masked. Second Capulet, 'tis more, 'tis more. His son is elder, sir. His son is 30. Capulet, will you tell me that? His son was but a ward 2 years ago. Romeo, to a serving man, what lady is that which doth enrich the hand of yonder knight? Capulet slips back through time, and when he stops slipping, it is Romeo who speaks and goes to woo Juliet. Capulet was Romeo. Romeo is Capulet. And so, by substitution, the lover of the daughter is the father. The mask is a device not so much to enable young love as to enable the old to imagine young love. In Romeo and Juliet, play acting with the categories of adult and child can lead to exhilarating delight, pleasurably moralistic revulsion, and sometimes to tragedy. If in our own day we have pushed the onset of adulthood past the tweens, past the teens, and even to some degree up into the 20s, that makes the play's insights and its sometimes exasperating perversities more relevant, not less.
Now, a number of you said as much in our critique of the previous essay, that is to say, the Rosenberg essay, and I like that we finish with this question of relevancy. There's always a debate, as we have said before. We are the stories we tell, the stories we retell, the stories we accept. Here, notice an example of that. The stories we reject, obviously, that would be the Rosenberg essay. Notice what it is, though, that here we're going to be told is the reasons why we should accept on some level this story. And Berlatsky's obviously going to make some of the very arguments that we were making earlier in our discussions, which can be found at learnstrong.net. Notice, first of all, he begins by making the observation that the texts that one reads in high school are read differently in 25 years. I think that's an important observation that has to be made now. Hey guys, all the stuff that we're studying, if I had had you read it when you were in 6th grade, you would have a different take. For example, R&J. If we studied R&J in 6th grade, you'd have a different view. It's not that you couldn't understand much of the play in 6th grade. You certainly could have. But you have, in 6th grade still, there's a whole lot about guys and girls, as we say in 303, that we haven't yet really experienced. You know what I'm saying? And to that degree, reading the play in 9th grade is different from reading it in 6th grade. Let's go ahead and admit it. When I had my seniors reread this play, and I do in AP, they have to admit that so much has happened in the 4 years of high school that allows them to qualify. One great example of that, as evidenced by so often my AP guys pointing it out as seniors, that really this isn't a play as much about love as we see in our lectures. Romeo and Juliet aren't actually on the stage together very often in this play. It's really a play about power and politics, isn't it? And families and the dynamics within families. But notice here, we're going to talk more particularly about how the play seems to be more about childish behavior than it does about children themselves. And of course, we've made this observation a number of times in our arguments together. Notice he says he enjoyed in paragraph 4 rereading this, and then he goes immediately to one of our favorite scenes from the play where the guy walks up to the girl in the middle of the food court at the mall, doesn't know her at all, she doesn't know him, and he walks up to her and he says, "Can I have a kiss?" And of course, asking that, even today, as many of you are smiling because you've said it in class, even today that's seen as a little bit over the line. Whoa, you don't do that. That's a little bit just too much direct. Even if the guy wants the kiss, or the girl even today wants the kiss from the guy, she's not allowed, or he's not allowed to just walk up and be so abrupt. And yet notice that right away, and this is going to be Berlatsky's argument later on, the language is so stunning as Juliet says, "I'd love to kiss," and she puts her hands up so that we can kiss or touch hands, and Romeo says, "Can we let lips do what hands do?" because she makes the observation that kissing hands references prayer, right? And the whole notion of prayer has to do with longing, and of course that has everything to do with growing up and all of that, right? Now, he will make the observation that while, yes, of course, it is about age in paragraph 7, it's really in many ways a source of fascination for the elderly. And then in paragraph 8, he goes into this whole argument about old versus young. He makes the observation that it is true that Romeo and Juliet behave in very kind of childlike ways, but it's also true that many of the adults in the play behave in childlike ways. And I think that this argument that is often made that Juliet's just a silly girl is in large measure misunderstood if one studies the play closely, because especially when she decides to drink the potion, she's got to make a majorly grown-up decision. That is to say, to fake your own death through the drinking of poison, or what could be poison, or it's potion, right? She says, I don't know for sure, one way or the other. And then to recognize that you're going to wake up in the total dark in a mausoleum with a bunch of dead bodies around you, including your cousin Tybalt. I mean, that takes some serious courage. I mean, that's not a decision by a little girl. That's a 13-year-old girl. That's a decision that you would expect, for example, a more mature young person or an adult to make, right? So we're going to play that game. By paragraph 9, I really like this line. And then there are moments where it seems like old and young don't really act all that differently, right? And then we got all kinds of examples of this. And as we said before, I mean, if anybody asks rationally in the play, it's obviously Juliet's dad who goes from saying to Paris, why don't you get to know her first, to let's marry our daughter, our 13-year-old daughter, off to Paris, yay. And there doesn't seem to be much reason for his change of heart other than Juliet's sad because Tybalt, so he believes it, Tybalt is dead, right? Notice the repetition of the use of the word manipulated in paragraph 11, and this is what we have said, of course, many times. Manipulation is just another way to talk about power, and this is clearly a political play, as we have said many times. The play begins with issues of power and contest and fighting and the biting of a thumb and insulting. Of course, it continues with Paris asking for Juliet at age 13. Clearly, he's not interested in sex. He's interested in marrying his family's wealth to the family of the Capulets and their wealth, and especially their power. And the fact that Juliet is an only child means that he's going to get all of the family wealth once Lord Capulet is dead. So clearly there's a whole lot of economic reasons why, as we've said in other lectures, Paris is very interested in Juliet, right? And of course, we could make the argument, Juliet's wise beyond her years. She doesn't want to marry Paris, and so she convinces Romeo, let's do this thing. And once, of course, she's married to Romeo, she can't be married to Paris. You see how that one works, and we've said that in other lectures. All of that manipulation is focused on in paragraph 11. But what I love in paragraph 11 is, of course, what we've said all along in our lectures. If you're going to read Shakespeare well, you've got to celebrate the language itself, right? And that's why we always come back to the actual language. And of course, in a scene that we've studied already, it is beautiful that Lord Capulet is sitting there talking about what it was 25 years ago. His buddy says, no, it's at least 30 years ago. In other words, it was a long time ago that Lord Capulet says, I used to love to come to these parties and meet the girl. That is to say, and it's a great line, right? In the play, in paragraph 13, Capulet slips back through time, and when he stops slipping, it's Romeo who speaks and goes to Juliet. Capulet was Romeo, and Romeo is Capulet. And so by substitution, the lover of the daughter is the father. The mask is a device not so much to enable young love as to enable the old to imagine young love. It is a beautiful, I mean, to me, that's the heart of the essay. That's the heart of the critique. And I think that we could argue here now together that there's something being said here that I think is provocative. That is to say, we are the stories that we tell and retell. We're the stories we accept, and we're stories we reject. But the question becomes, why do we accept certain stories? And then why later do we reject them? And what is it about these stories that make them somehow seem so real to us? Well, I hope that you've enjoyed this back and forth between the two. And now, obviously, at 3B, you get to decide. Thank you.